The peasant woman pressed fresh cow dung directly into her son's gaping axe wound, the warm excrement mixing with blood as she packed it deep into the severed muscle tissue. She believed the steaming manure would draw out evil humors and prevent the wound from festering, unaware that she was introducing millions of bacteria directly into his bloodstream. Within 3 days, the boy's leg had swollen to twice its normal size, black streaks racing up toward his heart as sepsis consumed his body from within. Medieval medical practice was not simply primitive, it was systematically deadly. The treatments that peasants and even trained physicians applied to wounds were based on ancient theories that bore no relationship to biological reality, creating interventions that often killed patients faster than their original injuries. Archaeological analysis of medieval medical texts and surviving treatment implements reveals a civilization that approached healing through methods that would be recognized today as forms of torture. The physical evidence of medieval wound treatment, preserved in medical manuscripts and archaeological sites, tells the story of a society that inflicted additional suffering on the injured through practices that seemed designed to maximize pain and infection. These were not desperate measures born of ignorance. They were systematic applications of medical theories that had been passed down through generations, codified in authoritative texts, and practiced by respected healers across Europe. Medieval medical theory, derived from ancient Greek and Roman sources, held that wounds were caused by an imbalance of bodily humors and required the introduction of natural substances to restore equilibrium. Animal dung was considered particularly effective because it was believed to possess both heat and moisture in perfect balance, making it ideal for drawing out the cold and dry corruption that caused wounds to fester. The medical texts of the period provide specific instructions for preparing and applying animal waste to wounds. The 13th century surgical manual Practica Chirurgica by Roger Frugardi recommends fresh horse dung mixed with wine for deep cuts, while pig excrement was prescribed for burns and abrasions. The freshness of the dung was considered crucial. The warmer and more recently expelled, the more potent its healing properties. Medieval physicians categorized different types of animal waste according to their supposed therapeutic properties. Cow dung was believed to be best for wounds on the torso because cattle were considered temperate animals whose waste would not overheat the injury. Sheep dung was recommended for head wounds because sheep were thought to possess superior intelligence, making their waste beneficial for brain-related injuries. The application process was systematic and thorough. Medical texts describe packing wounds completely full of fresh excrement, then covering the area with additional layers of dung mixed with various plant materials. The dung was left in place for days or weeks, with fresh applications added as the original material dried and fell away. But animal waste was only one component of a comprehensive system of wound contamination that medieval medicine had elevated to an art form. Medieval medical practice was governed by the theory of 4 bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, which supposedly determine health and disease. Wounds were understood as disruptions in the humoral balance that required specific interventions to restore harmony. This theoretical framework led to treatments that systematically introduce infectious agents into injured tissue. According to humoral theory, different types of wounds required different types of correction. A wound that appeared too dry needed moist substances applied to it, leading to the use of rotting organic matter, animal urine, and decomposing plant materials. Wounds that seemed too cold required heating agents, often consisting of caustic chemicals or burning materials applied directly to open flesh. The categorization system was elaborate and specific. Medical texts from the period describe detailed protocols for determining the humoral nature of wounds based on their appearance, smell, and the patient's overall constitution. A pale, cold wound in a person of sanguine temperament would receive different treatment than a red-hot wound in someone of melancholic disposition. The theory also dictated that wounds should not be allowed to heal too quickly, as this would trap corrupted humors inside the body. Medical practitioners would deliberately keep wounds open and suppurating for weeks or months, applying irritating substances to prevent natural healing processes from occurring. This systematic approach to preventing healing created optimal conditions for bacterial infection, gangrene, and sepsis, turning minor injuries into life-threatening conditions through deliberate medical intervention. Medieval healers believed that God had provided natural remedies for human ailments by creating plants and animals whose appearance indicated their therapeutic uses. This doctrine of signatures led to wound treatments based on superficial resemblances rather than any understanding of biological processes. Yellow flowers were used to treat jaundice because their color resembled yellowed skin. Red substances were applied to bleeding wounds because the color correspondence was thought to indicate healing power. Animal organs that resembled human organs were consumed or applied externally to treat problems in the corresponding body parts. For wound treatment, this theory led to the use of substances that visually resembled healthy or injured tissue. The spongy texture of certain fungi was thought to make them ideal for treating wounds because they resembled the appearance of healing flesh. The bloody appearance of certain animal organs made them desirable as wound dressings. The doctrine also explained why animal dung was considered therapeutic. Its warm, moist appearance when fresh was thought to resemble the natural state of healthy tissue inside the body. The steam rising from fresh excrement was interpreted as evidence of its life-giving properties. This visual approach to medicine meant that treatments were selected based on appearance rather than effectiveness, leading to the systematic application of harmful substances that looked like they should be beneficial. Medieval physicians, trained in universities and licensed by authorities, often prescribed more dangerous treatments than folk healers because their education was based on authoritative texts that codified harmful practices. The most learned doctors were often the most deadly because they followed established protocols that had been refined over centuries to maximize theoretical correctness rather than patient survival. University-trained physicians had access to sophisticated surgical instruments and rare medicinal substances that allowed them to inflict more systematic damage than untrained healers. Their surgical kits included specialized tools for opening wounds, scraping bone, and introducing foreign substances deep into tissue. The precision of these instruments meant that trained physicians could introduce infections more effectively than crude folk treatments. The licensing system that governed medieval medical practice actually protected and promoted dangerous treatments by giving official sanction to theoretical frameworks that were fundamentally flawed. Healers who deviated from established protocols could lose their licenses, creating institutional pressure to continue harmful practices even when they were obviously killing patients. Medical training in medieval universities focused heavily on theoretical knowledge from ancient texts with little emphasis on observation or experimentation. This meant that educated physicians were more likely to apply textbook treatments that contradicted evidence from their own experience. The social status of university-trained physicians also meant that their treatments were more likely to be accepted and followed by patients, even when the results were clearly harmful. The authority of medical education created a system where the most dangerous healers were also the most trusted and respected. Medieval medical texts provide detailed recipes for wound treatments that read like formulations designed to maximize bacterial growth and tissue damage. These salves combined animal waste with other organic materials in mixtures that created ideal environments for dangerous microorganisms. A typical wound salve from the 14th century combined fresh cow dung with honey, crushed earthworms, and various herbs, all mixed together and left to ferment for several days before application. The fermentation process was intended to activate the healing properties of the ingredients, but actually created conditions that promoted bacterial multiplication. Many salve recipes included human waste as well as animal excrement. The sacred salve, described in several medieval medical manuscripts, combined human urine, animal dung, and decomposing plant matter in specific proportions determined by astrological calculations. The mixture was applied to wounds while still warm from fermentation. The preparation methods for these salves often involved additional contamination through unsanitary handling procedures. Medical texts describe mixing ingredients by hand, storing prepared salves in containers that were also used for food preparation, and applying treatments with unwashed instruments that had been used on multiple patients. The complexity of these recipes gave them an aura of scientific sophistication that disguised their fundamental dangerousness. The more elaborate the preparation process, the more effective the treatment was believed to be, leading to increasingly complex mixtures that introduced multiple sources of contamination simultaneously. Medieval medical practice included systematic burning of wound tissue using heated metal instruments, boiling oil, or caustic chemicals applied directly to open flesh. This cauterization was believed to prevent corruption from spreading through the body, but actually created additional tissue damage that increased infection risks. The instruments used for cauterization were crude iron tools heated in open fires until they glowed red hot. Medical texts describe applying these burning implements directly to wound surfaces, holding them in place until the flesh was thoroughly seared. The smell of burning human tissue was considered a sign that the treatment was working effectively. Different types of burns were prescribed for different types of wounds. Deep puncture wounds were treated with pointed cauterization tools that were thrust into the wound channel to burn the entire depth of the injury. Surface wounds received broad cauterization that burned away layers of skin and underlying tissue. The timing of cauterization was considered crucial to its effectiveness. Medical texts specified that burns should be applied while wounds were still fresh and bleeding before natural healing processes could begin. This meant that patients often received cauterization within hours of their initial injury, adding severe burns to whatever trauma they had already suffered. The chemical cauterization methods were even more damaging than heated metal tools. Treatments included applying concentrated acids, alkalis, and toxic plant extracts directly to wound tissue. These substances would continue burning flesh for hours after application, creating ongoing tissue destruction that extended far beyond the original injury site. Medieval healers sometimes deliberately introduced fly larvae into wounds, believing that maggots would consume corrupted flesh and leave healthy tissue intact. This practice, while revolting, occasionally produced beneficial results because the maggots would indeed consume dead and infected tissue while leaving living flesh alone. The application of maggots to wounds was a deliberate process involving the capture and cultivation of specific fly species whose larvae were considered most effective for medical purposes. Healers would expose wounds to flies or place rotting meat near injuries to encourage egg laying, then monitor the development of larvae within the wound tissue. Medical texts from the period provide detailed instructions for maggot therapy, including specifications for which types of flies produce the most beneficial larvae and how long the maggots should be allowed to remain in wounds before removal. The process was considered a sophisticated treatment that required specialized knowledge and careful monitoring. The success of maggot therapy was attributed to the supposed ability of the larvae to distinguish between healthy and corrupted tissue, a property that medieval healers believed was divinely granted. Modern medical understanding recognizes that maggots do indeed preferentially consume dead tissue and can actually help clean infected wounds. However, the medieval application of maggot therapy was often combined with other harmful treatments that negated any potential benefits. Wounds treated with maggots were also typically packed with animal dung, treated with caustic substances, or subjected to other interventions that introduced infections even as the maggots cleaned dead tissue. Medieval wound treatment relied heavily on plant-based remedies that were often more toxic than therapeutic. The herbal knowledge passed down through folk traditions and codified in medical texts included numerous plants that were actually poisonous when applied to open wounds or consumed as medicine. Nightshade plants, including deadly nightshade and black henbane, were commonly used in wound salves because their numbing properties were believed to indicate healing power. These plants contain alkaloids that can cause hallucinations, respiratory paralysis, and death when absorbed through wounded tissue. Medieval medical texts described these symptoms as signs that the treatment was working to expel corrupted humors. Mercury-containing plants and mineral preparations were also widely used for wound treatment. Mercury compounds were believed to have purifying properties that could cleanse wounds of corruption. The heavy metal poisoning caused by mercury absorption through wound tissue created neurological symptoms that were interpreted as evidence of spiritual healing. Many plant-based wound treatments included species that are now known to be highly allergenic or irritating to human tissue. Poison ivy, certain mushrooms, and various tree barks were commonly applied to wounds, causing additional inflammation and tissue damage that was believed to be part of the healing process. The preparation methods for herbal wound treatments often increased their toxicity. Plants were frequently fermented, combined with animal waste, or prepared in ways that concentrated their most harmful compounds. The resulting preparations were far more dangerous than the original plant materials. Medieval medical treatment varied dramatically based on social class, with peasants receiving the most dangerous treatments while nobility had access to somewhat less harmful alternatives. This medical hierarchy was not based on ability to pay for better treatment, but on theories about the different medical needs of different social classes. Peasants were believed to have coarser constitutions that could tolerate stronger treatments, leading to the prescription of more caustic and contaminated remedies for the lower classes. Animal dung, caustic chemicals, and burning treatments were considered appropriate for peasant patients because their base nature supposedly required crude interventions. Nobility received treatments that were theoretically more refined but often equally dangerous. Aristocratic patients might receive purified animal waste mixed with expensive spices, or burns applied with gold-plated instruments rather than crude iron tools. The materials were more expensive, but the fundamental approaches remained deadly. The different treatment protocols were justified by medical theories that attributed different humoral balances to different social classes. Peasants were thought to be naturally hot and moist, requiring cold and dry treatments that included caustic substances and burning. Nobles were considered more temperate, requiring gentler but often equally harmful interventions. The class-based medical system also meant that peasants were more likely to receive experimental treatments, as their lives were considered less valuable than those of their social superiors. New and untested remedies were tried on peasant patients before being refined for use on higher status individuals. Medieval monasteries served as centers of medical learning and practice, combining religious beliefs with ancient medical theories to create treatment protocols that were often more dangerous than secular medicine. Monastic healers believed that physical suffering was spiritually beneficial, leading to treatments that deliberately increased patient pain and distress. Monastic medical texts describe wound treatments that were explicitly designed to test patient faith through extreme pain. Burns, caustic applications, and the introduction of irritating substances were justified as spiritual disciplines that would purify the soul while healing the body. The more painful the treatment, the more spiritually beneficial it was considered to be. The religious framework of monastic medicine also led to the use of substances that had symbolic rather than therapeutic value. Holy water mixed with animal waste, blessed herbs that were actually toxic, and relics that were contaminated with infectious agents were applied to wounds because of their spiritual significance rather than any medical properties. Monastic healers often combined medical treatment with religious ritual in ways that increased infection risks. Wounds were exposed during lengthy prayer ceremonies, treated with substances that had been handled by multiple people, and dressed with materials that had been used in religious observances without regard for cleanliness. The monastic emphasis on submission to divine will also discourage innovation or questioning of established treatments, even when they were clearly harmful. Monks were expected to follow traditional remedies regardless of their effectiveness, creating institutional resistance to medical progress. Medieval surgery, even when performed by trained practitioners, often involved procedures that created more tissue damage than the original injuries. Surgical instruments were crude, sterilization was unknown, and the surgical techniques were based on theoretical principles rather than anatomical knowledge. Wound exploration was a standard surgical procedure that involved probing injuries with metal instruments to determine their depth and extent. This probing was performed without sterilization and often introduced foreign materials deep into wound channels. The metal probes used for exploration were the same instruments used on multiple patients, spreading infections between cases. Surgical drainage procedures involved creating additional incisions to allow corrupted humors to escape from wounds. These drainage cuts were often larger than the original injuries and were typically left open for extended periods to ensure continued drainage. The additional wound surface area created more opportunities for infection while serving no therapeutic purpose. Amputation was performed with saws and knives that were shared between patients and cleaned only with water or wine. The amputation sites were typically cauterized with burning irons or boiling oil, creating severe burns in addition to the traumatic surgical wounds. Post-surgical care involved packing amputation sites with animal dung and other contaminated materials. The surgical procedures were often performed without effective pain control, using only herbal preparations that had limited anesthetic properties. The trauma of surgery combined with inadequate pain management created physiological stress that reduced patients' ability to survive infections and heal properly. The cumulative effect of medieval wound treatment was to transform minor injuries into life-threatening conditions through systematic medical intervention. Archaeological analysis of medieval skeletal remains shows evidence of infections that were clearly caused by treatment rather than the original injuries. Bone analysis reveals patterns of infection that begin at wound sites and spread to the skeletal system in ways that indicate introduction of bacteria through medical treatment. The progression of these infections shows that they developed after the original trauma, during the healing period when medical treatments would have been applied. Historical records document mortality rates that were significantly higher for treated wounds than for similar injuries that received no medical attention. Soldiers who received battlefield surgery had lower survival rates than those who were left to heal without intervention, indicating that medical treatment was more dangerous than the original injuries. The documentation of treatment outcomes in medieval medical texts reveals an awareness that many patients died during or shortly after receiving standard treatments. However, these deaths were attributed to the severity of the original injuries or to divine will rather than to the treatments themselves. The persistence of these deadly treatments, despite their obvious failure, indicates a medical system that was more concerned with theoretical correctness than patient survival. The authority of ancient texts and established practice was considered more important than evidence from direct observation. The wooden bowls that held the dung have rotted away, the metal instruments have rusted to dust, and the patients have been dead for centuries. But the medical texts remain, written in careful Latin script by learned men who believed they were healing when they were actually killing. In those pages, we see a civilization that approached human suffering with systematic cruelty disguised as compassion, where the desire to help became a mechanism for causing additional harm. The next time you clean a wound with antiseptic and cover it with sterile bandages, remember the countless generations who sought healing and found instead a medical system that turned minor injuries into death sentences through the application of ancient wisdom that was actually ancient ignorance crystallized in the deadly practice.